The early morning sun cut through the clouds above the Solomon Islands, painting streaks of gold over the dense emerald canopy below. In the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Harris gripped the controls with white-knuckled intensity. The whine of the twin engines vibrated through the frame of the aircraft as tracer fire lit the air around him. Below, the familiar silhouettes of Japanese Zeros swirled in tight formations, their deadly agility a nightmare for any Allied pilot. Yet today something was different. As Harris banked sharply, almost upside down, he felt the aircraft respond with a precision that was uncanny. He twisted, inverted, and looped in ways that would have seemed suicidal only hours before. The Japanese pilots, momentarily stunned, hesitated. Their reaction was slower than usual. They had never seen this maneuver executed so deliberately, so skillfully. It was a move that defied conventional air combat logic, one that bordered on insanity. And yet it worked. Across the skies, the battle raged. Explosions of bullets and shrapnel illuminated the cloud layer like fleeting fireworks. The roar of engines blended with the cries of men fighting for their lives. Every second was a test of nerve, skill, and ingenuity. And in the midst of this chaos, a question hung in the air, invisible but heavy. Why were American pilots flying upside down? And how could this strange, daring tactic change the course of the war in the Pacific? The Solomons Campaign, a series of small islands far from the American mainland, had become a proving ground for aerial combat. Here, pilots faced the deadly combination of dense jungle below, limited supply lines, and a relentless enemy whose Mitsubishi A6M0 could outmaneuver almost anything the Allies had at the time. Standard tactics, tight formations, dive and climb maneuvers, coordinated attacks, were being rendered obsolete by the Zero's unmatched agility. American losses mounted, frustration grew, and a new approach was desperately needed. Enter the P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter unlike any other in the Allied arsenal. It was fast, it was powerful, and it could endure maneuvers that would have shredded lesser planes. But even with these advantages, American pilots initially struggled. The skies over Guadalcanal were littered with downed aircraft, burned-out engines, and the echoes of heroic but futile efforts. Something had to change. Something radical. Something that would shock the enemy and turn the tide. It was in these crucibles of trial and error that a daring few began experimenting. They inverted their aircraft, executed high-risk loops, and tested maneuvers that were whispered about in mess halls as impossible. At first, commanders frowned, labeling these pilots reckless. Yet the results were undeniable. Enemy formations faltered. Confusion rippled through the ranks of seasoned Japanese pilots, and slowly, a legend began to form. The Americans were not only adapting, they were innovating in the skies in ways no one had anticipated. And so the question that would haunt both sides persisted. What drove these men to risk everything, to twist their machines upside down, and to turn death-defying maneuvers into tactical advantage? The answer lay not in raw courage alone, nor in the machines they flew, but in a spark of ingenuity that would redefine aerial warfare in the Pacific forever. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the island jungles, one thing was clear: the air above the Solomons would never be the same. A new chapter in aviation history was beginning, written in smoke trails and the roar of engines, where upside-down flight was no longer a stunt. It was a strategy. By mid-1942, the Solomon Islands had become a pivotal battleground in the Pacific theater. Guadalcanal, a small speck of land with dense jungles and hidden airstrips, represented far more than its size suggested. Whoever controlled the air above these islands could dictate the flow of supplies, reinforcements, and ultimately the survival of ground forces. For the Japanese, the skies were dominated by the Mitsubishi A6M0, a lightweight, highly maneuverable fighter that could outturn nearly every American plane it faced. For the United States, the challenge was clear: to counter this aerial supremacy with machines and tactics that could survive and strike back. The P-38 Lightning, a sleek twin-engine fighter designed by Lockheed, arrived on the scene with a mixture of promise and skepticism. With its distinctive twin booms and central nacelle, it was unlike anything the Japanese had encountered. It could dive faster than any Zero, fire concentrated bursts of 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon from a single nose-mounted array, and endure maneuvers that would have shredded lesser planes. Yet, despite its advantages, American pilots faced repeated setbacks. The Zero's agility in dogfights, coupled with their ability to climb rapidly and exploit blind spots, often left the P-38 struggling to gain a decisive edge. Air combat over the Solomons was brutal and unforgiving. Pilots like Major Richard Dick Bong, soon to be America's highest-scoring ace, and his contemporaries learned quickly that textbook maneuvers, tight formation flying, coordinated climbs, and diving attacks were often insufficient against a nimble adversary. Losses mounted, morale wavered, and the pressure on commanders to innovate grew heavier by the week. Traditional tactics, forged in Europe against slower and less maneuverable opponents, simply did not translate to the Pacific skies. Within this crucible, a handful of forward-thinking pilots and tacticians began to experiment. Names like Captain Thomas McGuire, later credited with refining aggressive interception strategies, and Colonel Paul Wurtsmith, whose directives emphasized adaptability and initiative, emerged as leaders of a subtle revolution in air combat thinking. Engineers on the ground, analyzing flight data and damage reports, suggested leveraging the P-38's strengths rather than forcing it into a dogfight on the enemy's terms. The stage was set for a tactical evolution born out of necessity. Japanese pilots, confident from early victories, were unprepared for what they would soon encounter. Their Zeros, light and agile, had outclassed every Allied plane in the early months of the campaign. But intelligence reports, often captured from downed aircraft or intercepted communications, hinted at strange maneuvers being tested by American pilots. There were whispers of inverted dives, sudden vertical climbs, and unpredictable loops. Initially dismissed as recklessness, these maneuvers would soon prove to be the seeds of a strategy that could shift the balance of power in the skies. The P-38's capabilities allowed pilots to think differently. Unlike single-engine fighters, it could withstand the stresses of inverted flight and high-speed diving without structural failure. This opened the door to tactics previously considered impossible. The combination of human ingenuity, mechanical resilience, and battlefield necessity began to crystallize into a new doctrine. The P-38 was no longer just a plane, it was a platform for innovation, a tool through which daring pilots could challenge the conventional limits of aerial combat. As the campaign in the Solomons continued, skirmishes escalated from testing grounds to crucibles of survival. Every sortie carried lessons, successes that were fleeting, failures that were costly. By studying both, The Americans were beginning to uncover the principle that would soon allow them to turn the tide. Sometimes, victory required not just courage, but the audacity to defy the expected. And in these dense tropical skies, that defiance would take on a form that would shock friend and foe alike. By late 1942, the skies over the Solomon Islands had become a theater of frustration and mounting losses for American pilots. Every mission seemed to underline the harsh reality. Conventional tactics were no longer enough. The Mitsubishi Zeros, light and nimble, exploited every weakness. Formation flying, once considered a cornerstone of air strategy, now became a liability. Pilots found themselves caught in a deadly dance, outmaneuvered, outgunned, and often out of options. Lieutenant John "Jack" Stevens remembered one mission vividly. Flying a P-38 over Guadalcanal, his squadron encountered a formation of Japanese Zeros near Henderson Field. "We climbed, we banked, we dove, but they were always one step ahead," Stevens later recounted. Within minutes, 2 of his comrades were shot down. The adrenaline and fear were suffocating, yet the enemy showed no hesitation. Their precision was terrifying. The Americans began to realize that sheer bravery alone would not win these battles. The problem was systemic. The P-38s, though faster and more heavily armed than the Zeros, were less maneuverable at low speeds. Dogfights that relied on tight turning circles favored the Japanese, who exploited every moment to strike decisively. Every loss weighed heavily on the surviving pilots. Letters home spoke of exhaustion and fear, but also of a simmering determination. Something had to change. The tactical stalemate had psychological consequences as well. Pilots reported growing anxiety when facing the Zero's famed agility. The sense of invincibility the Japanese enjoyed was a constant pressure, forcing American flyers to push themselves and their machines to the limit. Misjudged climbs, mistimed dives, and split-second decisions could, and often did, mean death. Commanders observed a troubling pattern. Experienced pilots were being forced to abandon established tactics, improvising under extreme duress, often with catastrophic results. Specific episodes underscored the crisis. In one particularly harrowing encounter, Major Richard Dick Bong led a formation of P-38s into combat, only to watch 2 aircraft spiral out of control after attempting standard turning maneuvers against a superior Zero formation. Damage reports later revealed that structural stress had pushed the planes dangerously close to their limits, and only luck or skill prevented further catastrophe. Each mission reinforced the brutal truth. Relying on conventional wisdom against this opponent was increasingly futile. Amid this deadlock, a small cadre of pilots began to experiment. They understood that the P-38's strength was not in mimicking the Zero's agility, but in exploiting its own unique capabilities: speed, firepower, and structural resilience. Discussions in mess halls and briefing rooms were tense, but filled with creativity. Pilots sketched maneuvers on napkins, debated angles of attack, and theorized about inverted dives and high-risk loops. These were ideas that seemed reckless, almost absurd, but desperation and necessity had created fertile ground for innovation. The pressure from the front lines and the repeated failures of conventional tactics created a sense of urgency. The Americans needed a solution that could restore confidence, preserve aircraft, and above all, surprise the enemy. And in this crucible of stress, loss, and determination, a spark of ingenuity was about to emerge, one that would redefine air combat over the Solomons. What followed was not an immediate triumph, but the birth of a concept that seemed impossible at first glance. The first pilots to attempt it faced skepticism, ridicule, and danger beyond imagination. Yet they persevered, driven by a simple, powerful idea. To defeat an unbeatable opponent, sometimes one must defy everything known about the rules of flight and engage the enemy in a way they could never anticipate. In the dense, tropical air over Guadalcanal, this desperate innovation would soon take shape. It was risky, it was audacious, and it would shock both friend and foe alike. The deadlock, the failures, and the relentless pressure had all laid the foundation for a breakthrough, an upside-down revolution in aerial tactics. The first seeds of innovation emerged not in boardrooms or engineering labs, but in the crucible of combat itself. Pilots like Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Harris and Captain Thomas McGuire began experimenting with maneuvers that defied conventional wisdom. The idea was audacious. Invert the P-38 in mid-flight, dive upon enemy formations from unexpected angles, and leverage the aircraft's structural strength and firepower to strike before the Japanese could react. At first, the tactic seemed reckless, almost suicidal, and many in command considered it sheer folly. Yet necessity drove experimentation. Small-scale trials over unpopulated stretches of the Solomon skies allowed a few daring pilots to push the limits. Harris described his first inverted dive. "I twisted the plane upside down, heart-hammering, and focused on the enemy below. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, with the guns aligned, I fired and watched as the lead zero faltered. It worked. It really worked." These early trials, though risky, revealed a crucial truth. The Japanese were unprepared for such unconventional assaults. Their finely tuned formation flying relied on predictable patterns. Suddenly, those patterns became vulnerabilities. The first real test came during a mission over Guadalcanal in September 1942. A small flight of P-38s, led by Harris and McGuire, encountered a dozen Zeros patrolling near Henderson Field. In a maneuver that seemed straight out of a stunt pilot's manual, Harris inverted his aircraft, diving through the formation with machine guns blazing. The Japanese pilots, trained to anticipate horizontal attacks, were momentarily stunned. Chaos rippled through their ranks, and in those critical seconds, the Americans scored multiple kills without losing a single aircraft. The reaction from American command was mixed. Some officers were horrified, fearing catastrophic accidents if such maneuvers were attempted broadly. Others saw potential, recognizing that this audacious tactic leveraged both the P-38's capabilities and the element of surprise. After careful debriefings, additional missions were sanctioned, this time with an emphasis on training and precision. Manuals were updated, pilots were coached on controlled inversion dives, and the tactic began to move from improvisation to doctrine. Meanwhile, the Japanese quickly noted the disruption. Squadron commanders reported unprecedented confusion during encounters with P-38s. Veteran Zero pilots, accustomed to dominating dogfights through maneuverability and coordinated attacks, found themselves on the defensive against unpredictable inverted assaults. The psychological impact was significant. Hesitation, misjudgment, and miscommunication crept into formations that had previously been near flawless. The breakthrough was not merely technical, but philosophical. It demonstrated that air combat was not a rigid science. It was a dynamic battlefield where ingenuity could outmatch raw ability. By daring to defy conventional norms, these pilots turned their aircraft into instruments of strategic advantage. A maneuver once considered suicidal had become a tool to dominate the skies. Soon, stories of the inverted dive spread through the Allied forces. Pilots began calling it the lightning flip, a nod to the P-38's nickname. As the tactic was refined, it allowed for more daring attacks, coordinated strikes from unexpected angles, and an increase in overall air superiority. By exploiting the P-38's unique strengths, the Americans not only leveled the playing field, but also forced the Japanese to reconsider their own strategies. In the end, the birth of this tactic illustrated a timeless lesson. In war, as in life, progress often emerges from the courage to challenge the status quo, to risk failure in pursuit of innovation. In the skies above the Solomons, the upside-down flight was no longer a stunt. It was a revolution. The adoption of the upside-down maneuver began to reshape the air war over the Solomon Islands in dramatic fashion. Initially, only a handful of P-38 pilots dared to attempt it in combat. But as successes mounted, the tactic spread rapidly. What had once been considered reckless audacity became a hallmark of American ingenuity in the Pacific theater. One of the earliest documented victories occurred in October 1942. A small flight of 4 P-38s, led by Captain Thomas McGuire, encountered a larger formation of Japanese Zeros over the waters near Cape Esperance. Executing synchronized inverted dives, they struck from angles that the enemy could not anticipate. Within minutes, 2 Zeros were downed, and the remainder scattered in confusion. The maneuver not only neutralized superior numbers, but also boosted morale among American pilots, proving that creativity could triumph over raw maneuverability. The tactic, however, was not without risks. During training exercises, several pilots pushed the boundaries too far, leading to crashes and near-fatal incidents. The inverted dive placed immense stress on the airframe, and misjudged angles or hesitation could be catastrophic. Reports from the front lines emphasized that success required precision, timing, and nerves of steel. Lessons learned from these early mishaps informed revised protocols, ensuring that the tactic could be applied effectively without unnecessary loss. As victories accumulated, the impact on Japanese strategy became evident. Experienced Zero pilots, initially confident in their dominance, began to exercise greater caution. Formation tactics were adjusted to anticipate potential upside-down attacks, slowing their aggressive maneuvers and reducing their previously overwhelming momentum. Intelligence reports indicated mounting frustration. The Americans were unpredictable, daring, and increasingly effective. The psychological effect alone, forcing the enemy to second-guess their instincts, proved invaluable. The P-38's success in the Solomons campaign underscored a broader strategic shift. By exploiting the aircraft's strengths and embracing innovative maneuvers, American pilots could challenge superior numbers and counter the enemy's advantages. The upside-down tactic became an essential component of air combat doctrine in the Pacific, demonstrating that flexibility and creativity could decisively influence the battlefield. Notable aces, including Major Richard Bong and Captain McGuire, capitalized on these lessons, recording multiple kills using the technique and cementing their reputations. Their experiences highlighted both the triumphs and pitfalls of innovation. Daring moves could yield stunning results, but miscalculations were costly. The line between brilliance and disaster was razor-thin, yet it was precisely this risk that amplified the tactic's effectiveness. By the end of 1942, The cumulative effect was clear. American forces were no longer merely reacting to Japanese superiority. They were dictating the terms of engagement. Inverted attacks became a symbol of tactical evolution, demonstrating that even small changes in approach could have outsized consequences. The skies over Guadalcanal, once dominated by the lethal grace of the Zero, now bore witness to a new kind of aerial warfare, one where ingenuity, courage, and audacity combined to create a decisive advantage. In retrospect, the upside-down maneuver was more than a clever trick. It embodied the essence of wartime adaptation, the ability to confront failure, embrace risk, and transform adversity into opportunity. The lessons learned would resonate far beyond the Solomons, shaping air combat doctrine for years to come. Pilots who dared to invert their planes not only survived, they forged a legacy of innovation that would echo through the annals of military aviation history. The upside-down maneuvers over the Solomons did more than surprise enemy pilots. They reshaped the very philosophy of aerial combat. What began as a desperate attempt to survive against the agile Mitsubishi Zeros evolved into a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless pursuit of advantage in warfare. Pilots like Lieutenant James Harris and Captain Thomas McGuire, once viewed as reckless, became icons of innovation. Their courage, tempered by precision and calculated risk, set a standard for generations to come. In the years that followed, the lessons of the Solomons campaign informed training programs, aircraft design, and tactical doctrine across the Allied forces. The P-38's ability to withstand extreme maneuvers inspired engineers to design aircraft that could endure greater stresses, while the philosophy behind daring, unconventional tactics influenced countless missions across both the Pacific and European theaters. Innovation, it seemed, was as critical as firepower. Yet the legacy was not without cost. Many pilots paid the ultimate price testing the limits of man and machine. Some lost their lives in the very maneuvers that would later become celebrated strategy. The memory of their sacrifice lingered in every briefing room and every debriefing, a reminder that progress in war is often written in courage and blood. Even among survivors, the psychological toll of flying inverted, pushing machines to the edge, and confronting death midair left indelible marks. For the Japanese pilots, the sudden emergence of inverted attacks served as a humbling lesson. Dominance can never be taken for granted. Skilled as they were, they learned that adaptation is a relentless and unforgiving force. Every encounter with a P-38 executing the lightning flip demanded respect and recalibration, underscoring that in war, predictability is vulnerability. The story of these maneuvers, however, transcends technical innovation. It is, at its core, a story of audacity, the courage to challenge convention, to risk ridicule and disaster, and to transform desperation into decisive advantage. It reminds us that in moments of crisis, the human mind is capable of extraordinary invention, and that bravery without imagination can never achieve true mastery. As the sun set over the Solomon Islands, the echoes of those inverted dives lingered, not just in the engine's roar or the smoke trails they left behind, but in the enduring lesson that history rewards those who dare to see the impossible as a path forward. Lieutenant Harris, Captain McGuire, and countless unnamed pilots became more than warriors. They became symbols of the relentless human spirit, capable of turning fear into strategy, chaos into order, and risk into triumph. In the quiet aftermath, one truth resounded above all. In war, as in life, The boundaries of possibility are defined not by circumstance, but by courage and imagination. And in the skies over Guadalcanal, where ordinary flight gave way to extraordinary daring, the price of innovation became the gift of legacy. A reminder that sometimes, to rise above, one must first turn the world upside down.